Hey guys, in this video I'll be going over Unit 5, the free response question number 2. Okay, so I do think that this question was a little bit trickier than question number 1. There was a lot to interpret. Okay, so I think the most important part in this question is understanding what they were asking for. And to be honest, I got more information from this table than I did from their description of what they wanted us to do. But I'm going to read it anyway, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so let's start. So it says, this question involves the implementation of the password generator class, which generates strings containing initial passwords for online accounts. The password generator class supports the following functions. Creating a password consisting of a specific prefix, a period, and a randomly generated numeric portion of a specified length. Creating a password consisting of the default prefix a period, and a randomly generated numeric portion of specified length. Reporting how many passwords have been created. Okay, so that's a little bit confusing, but the first thing you need to pay attention to is the fact that they want us to create a password generator class. So the first thing you should have done is set up the structure for the password generator class. So let me go to my window. Okay, so this is Unit 5 FRQ number 2. Just to be safe, I imported everything from Java, right? So I have import star, meaning all the modules or libraries that are available. That way, in case I need to use anything, it's all there. Okay. So on line 5, this is where I'm creating my class. So public class, and they wanted us to call it password generator. Okay, so next comes declaring my fields. So I have to figure out what fields I need. And so here's what I did. Okay, looking at this table, they created 2 password objects. Password 1, PW1, and password 2, PW2. And I hope you notice that they use 2 different constructors, okay? So in the first statement, notice that the constructor had 2 parameters, number 4 and this 3-letter prefix CHS, okay? And then notice when they created password 2, they used a different format for the constructor. They only passed 1 parameter onto that constructor. So hopefully from the table, and I'll highlight the 2 pieces. So this part and this part, right? Because of these 2 parts, it's clear that we need 2 constructors, okay? And what else is clear is that these 2 constructors need the following fields. So we need a prefix, okay? A period, that's not going to be a variable because the period stays a period all the time. So don't worry about that. And then it says a randomly generated numeric portion of specified length. So this 4 right here is the length of that randomly generated portion. And this 6 right here is also an integer that represents the randomly generated portion. Okay, so here it's just saying the randomly generated portion is going to be 6 integers long. So just to give you guys an idea, the password generator, what it's doing, it's generating a password that starts with a specific prefix. So either a prefix that the user chooses, like in this scenario right here, CHS, or a default prefix A. Okay, so the password will have either a randomly not a random prefix, but a prefix that a user chooses, or a default prefix A, then a period, and then the last part will be a randomly generated numeric portion, so a bunch of numbers of a specified length that the user will specify. Okay, so we need 2 constructors. So let me show you the constructors first. Okay, so before we get into that, hopefully it's clear to you that we need at least two fields. We need a field that's for the length of that randomly generated portion, and we need a field for the prefix, either the default prefix, which is a, or the prefix that the user will choose. Okay, so the length will be an integer, so private int length. The prefix will be a bunch of letters, right? So, or a, the letter a, so that'll be a string. Now, you can ignore this third field for now. I'm going to talk about that later, but actually when I first started my code, I didn't even consider this, so this wasn't even here, okay? So we'll come back to that. So let's look at our constructors. So like I said, I hope you noticed that we needed two constructors, and how I knew is because of this. These two. The way they define their objects, PW1 and PW2, it was using two different ways. And also, they told us pretty much that we needed two constructors because of these two facts. Okay, so I mostly use the examples though, believe it or not. The examples helped me a lot more. So, looking at this, it has two parameters, an integer and a prefix. So going back to my code, I created a constructor, public password generator. Remember, the constructor name has to be the same as the class name. And it's going to take two things, an integer, okay, like we said here, 4 is an integer, and then a string, which is the prefix. So because the integer is representing the length, I called it L, and because the string is representing the prefix, I called it P. And then I set my field length equal to L and my field prefix equal to P. Okay, so that's for my first constructor. Now going back to the second constructor, which was used to construct object PW2, it only took in one parameter, which is the 6. Okay, so that's an integer, so I called it integer int L. And again, length equals L, that's fine. Now, when they only specify one parameter, okay, so going here, so if you look at this explanation here, the comment, it says, passwords generated by the PW2 object are composed of the default prefix a period, and 6 randomly generated digits. So it's still going to have a prefix, except now it's this default a. So I went back and I just put prefix equals a. Okay, so the difference between these two constructors is that one of them is taking in two parameters, the length and a specified prefix by the user. The other one is only taking in the length and setting the prefix to the default letter a. Hopefully these two together make more sense to you. Okay, moving on, looking at the table, I noticed I needed two methods, right? So if you notice, sorry, pw1.pwCount and pw1.pwGen. So those are both methods. And then I looked down the table and I didn't find any other methods. So I knew I needed two methods. And I actually started by generating the password. So I started with the method pwgen. Now, pwgen is supposed to give back a password, right? So it's a method that returns a random password. So it's public string because it's going to give back a random password, which is going to be a string, and it's called pwgen, and it doesn't take in any parameters. How did I know that? Well, because look at how they used it. They didn't enter any parameters inside of pwgen. Okay, so what I realized is that we need to generate a password, and remember, the overall structure of the password has to be the following. It has to be either the prefix that, so it's either going to be the prefix that the user picked, then a period, and then a bunch of randomly generated integer of length, whatever length the user picked. Or it's going to be the same thing, except if the user never chose a prefix, it's just going to be the default a. So no matter what, it's going to be prefix dot some random integers of length L, right? Or length, whatever length that the user chose. So here's what I did. What I did is, first I knew I needed to generate random integers, but not only did I need to generate random integers, I need to generate a random integer of length L, right? Or not L, in this case it would be length. The variable is length. Okay, so I created this empty string random num equals some blank string. And what I did is I used a for loop that ran as many times as the length that the user chose, right? So this is coming from the field length. Okay, and so for every iteration, what I did is, actually I don't need to put string in front of this anymore. What I did is I took my previous integer and I generated a new integer. Okay, so what this is going to do is it's going to generate, let's say that the user picked a length of 4, right, for the second half of their password. So they wanted 4 randomly generated digits, right? So each time this for loop ran, it generated a random integer and tacked it on at the end of whatever random digit was generated to begin with. So this is going to run the length. It's going to run as many times as the length that the user chose and generate a digit each time and tack it on to the end of random number. So in the end, you're going to get you know, as many random digits as the user wanted. Okay, now if you use math.random, this piece right here, you'll remember that it generates numbers from 0 to 0.999999, right? Now, we're not interested in those kinds of numbers. We're interested in digits, single digits, right? So think about what a single digit can be. A single digit can be anything from 0 to 9. So because math.random generates anything from 0 to 0.999, what I did is I took that and multiplied it by 10. So if it generates numbers from 0 to 0.999 and I multiply by 10, that means it's going to generate numbers from 0, because 0 times 10 is 0, to 0.999 times 10 is 9.999, right? Now that's still not perfect because we don't want to generate like 9.999. So all you had to do was typecast the whole thing as an integer, so it'll cut off the 0.999. And now we have random integers from 0 through 9. I recommend you just memorize this trick. If it doesn't make sense to you, just memorize it. This is a really nice, quick trick to get numbers from 0 through 9, which is a common thing that you should know how to do. Okay, so just to repeat myself, because I feel like my for loop was a little bit confusing when I was trying to explain it. What the for loop is doing is it's running as many times as the length that the user chose. And each time it runs, it generates a random integer or digit from 0 through 9. And because of this, right, sorry, this should say random number. Okay, because of this line right here, all I'm doing is adding each random digit that it generates to the end of random number. So if it runs the first time and it generates number 1, now random num just has 1, right? Remember, it's a string. Then it runs again, it generates another random integer, and so it's going to add it on to whatever random num was, which was 1. So now it's going to be, let's say it generates another digit, 9, so it's going to be 1, 9, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is giving us that randomly generated number that they're talking about. And then we're finally going to return the whole password. So remember, the whole password is not just that random part. It's the prefix, which is just a field here. Okay, so it's the prefix plus a period and plus that random number. Okay? So I'm returning that. Okay? Now, here's the part that might be a little bit confusing, and here's the part where I need to address this. The third field. Now, the third field comes from the fact that we need actually another method, which is PW count. Okay? So what PW count does is it reports how many passwords have been generated. Okay, so let's say they generate, so let's look at this table. I think this table, like I said, is very helpful. Okay, so when they create an object and they call PW count, it's 0 because they haven't called PWGen yet. So once they call PWGen on PW1 and they call it twice, then PW count goes up to 2. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. So once they called PWGen on PW1 twice, the count went up to 2. Sorry, guys. Okay, so then they create another object, PW2, and then they call the count function, and it's still 2 because creating an object, because we haven't called the PWGen method yet. So then they call the PWGen method again, and now, even though they called it on PW2, right, the count is 3. So it doesn't reset even though you're using a new object. So that's interesting. And so this is tricky. Instead of just having this counter variable that keeps track of passwords just be called private int, and I called it pass count, you had to make it static. Okay, so static just means that it's the same for every object you create. Basically, it just means that it's never going to reset, right? So basically, you're keeping track of all the passwords ever generated. Doesn't matter by which object. So that was the tricky part, is knowing that you need to make it static. Okay, if you're confused about that, I would look up static and what they mean in terms of fields. Okay, but basically, like I said, because this password count variable never resets back to 0, it just keeps accumulating, right? Or it keeps getting bigger and bigger anytime you generate a password, no matter what object you're using. It should be static because it applies to every object that you create. Okay, now the password count, PW count method just returns that field. So if you go to my method for PW count, it's public int because it's going to return an integer, and I'm just having it return pass count. Okay, but here's the trick. I had to increment by 1, so I had to increment pass count by 1 each time PWGen is called, because that's what happened here. Each time PWGen was called, the pass count went up. So here, PWGen, now we have pass count of 2. Then here, PWGen, and then pass count now is suddenly 3. So what that means is that anytime PWGen was called, the method, the pass count went up. So that's why I had to put this piece of code inside PWGen. And so that made PW count, the method, really easy. All it was returning the password count, or pass count is what I called it, which was this field. Okay, so slightly more confusing for sure. Definitely not the hardest problem, but there was a lot more involved. Notice I did use random, so I did have to import this piece of information right here. So there was a lot involved, and I did have to use a for loop as well. Okay, so I would definitely type this up, go over it, maybe listen to the video again, but that's basically it for this question. Okay.